Tonight's tale is called The King Who Betrayed His People and the Return of Dimensius, a history of Koresh, the Ethereals, and the shadow engine called Manaforge Omega. The sky over Koresh shattered. Light bent while the air trembled, and a shape without edges stepped into the world. It did not walk, it simply arrived, and space retreated from its presence. The name it wore was Dimensius, a Void Lord, a ruler of the dark between stars. On that day, compasses across Koresh, they spun inward, towers thrummed with alien resonance, and every living thing felt its bones answer to a hunger that had no mouth. The people who stood against that hunger would one day be called Ethereals, beings of will and memory bound in shimmering wrappings. They had been flesh, they had built cities under an arid sun and penned histories in gold and glass. But when Dimensius opened gateways around their world, twin tides poured in. Void sought to unmake, arcane swelled unchecked. In their last sane hour, the greatest artificers wove barriers above their cities, warding out the shadow. But the price was monumental. Raw arcane flooded the shielded domes and burned away bodies. What remained refused to die. Thought persisted against disillusion. Identity anchored itself through will alone. They learned to bind themselves with enchanted ribbons and filaments, and they returned to the walls to keep their children from vanishing. Among their leaders stood Salhadar, first an oracle and then a king. His title changed as the crisis deepened, and with it, the meaning of words like duty and survival. He gathered councils and sent scholars to study the wounds Dimensius tore through the sky. He lent his voice to plans that tasted of desperation. You see, on Koresh there were orders within orders. One of these was the Ravel, a circle of savants who studied forbidden methods because nothing else kept pace with the disaster. They stitched energy into lattices called Reshi ribbons, living bands of power that could hold a soul together and hold a dome against the storm. But the fight dragged across years. Pandemonius, a void general born of the same abyss as Dimensius, led legions through the broken air, and cities fell. The barriers flickered. The Ethereals kept learning, they shaped their bindings, they learned to travel the twisting never, that roiling space between worlds. They swore never again to be caught unready. But not all promises stayed pure. When the first domes failed, the exodus began. Salhadar gave the order to flee. He called that order a path to survival. It was also an ending. Many followed, and others, they remained to hold the last intact domes. Dimensius thickened around the world like a storm that forgot how to pass, and Koresh became memory and scar, and then rumor, and then oath. Elsewhere in the Great Dark, another story followed the same shadow. On Karkora, a world far from Koresh, Dimensius raised his hand again. There, a Naru called Tyr spent itself to save the people. Holy light washed the shadow away long enough for the living to stand. Even Void Lords could be banished when power met purpose. And that lesson travelled with those who had seen it. But the cost, that travelled with it too. The exiles scattered. Some turned inward and named vengeance as the only compass. The Ethereum, once rulers of Koresh, they swore to hunt Dimensius across the ages and to wield any force that could kill him. Others, they broke that vow when it curdled. The Protectorate formed. They were a band that would fight without surrendering what they believed made a people worth saving. But in this fracture hid a seed of later betrayal. Outland hung in ruins where a world had been torn apart by another war. In that shattered place lay Neverstorm, a waste of violet sky and floating land bridged by storms. And there, Blood Elf artificers had raised cyclopean engines called Manaforges. They were arcane mills that ground the air into power. The Ethereum studied those machines and took notes that should have been burned. At a site called Manaforge Altis, The storm line between invention and folly tore again. The air thinned to nothing and the forge imploded violently. Dimensius answered the call. The Protectorate gathered what they had, and Professor Debiri, an engineer among Ethereals, set camp at the foot of the ruins. Commander Amir directed strikes with the dispassion of a surgeon. Captain Said led a band of bound warriors up the scarred road, and when the time came, Said fixed his gaze on the ringing circle within Ultris and gave the order. They advanced, adventurers from other worlds joined them and stood where the shadow was thickest. "For Koresh," the Ethereals said, and they meant both a memory and a promise. Dimensius fell, the wound in the air sealed to a scar. And victories like this, they rarely end a story. What fell on that day was a manifestation, a shape anchored to a place. But the will behind it, that remained. The oath to destroy that will continued to shape the living. Years later, in the deep beneath Azeroth, the war within cracked open many old chests. Xalatath walked again, a priestess of the void with a history measured in masks. She had known Dimensius in an older age and had been bound to his will before severing the leash. She took an interest in power no one else should hold. And on other roads, the goblin city of Undermine shook. The Dark Heart changed hands and a phase thief named Azir carried that relic towards a new machine. Threads crossed above a broken world. Koresh still endured as fragments held together by will, and Tazavesh, once a market adrift between places, now stood as a refuge upon Koresh itself. Brokers, shrewd traders born in the same storm that made the Ethereals, had aligned with their cousins. Together they formed the Koresh Trust, a coalition with a single aim: restore what can be restored and protect what remains. Their ally Venari wore patience like armor and worked to seed life inside domes that still held air and color. Locust Walker returned as well, the void-taught mentor who had shown Illyria Windrunner how to drink from shadow without drowning. He had once been one of the Ravel. He carried one of the Reshi ribbons still. The old order stirred, called back by a crisis that looked too much like the one they had failed to stop. In the cracks between domes, another banner unfurled. The Shadow Guard moved with purpose that felt like a memory and revenge bound into one. They wore the Ethereum's cut of robe and blade, but their hearts beat to a darker drum. At their head stood a king who should have remained a name on a ruined wall. Salhadar walked again. He had sworn to kill Dimensius at any cost, and now he revealed that the cost had been paid in advance. Long ago, ahead of his exodus, he had formed a pact with the very being that shattered his world. In public, he made oaths against the Voiced, but while in private, he placed his crown beyond judgment by surrendering it to the very darkness he named as the enemy. Betrayal ripples outward, and the Protectorate learned that the Ethereum's hunt contained a rot. The Wastelanders, they were a sect that venerated Koresh's world soul and despised the Ravel's choices. They were pulled into the struggle by oaths the Nexus King could still command. Venari strengthened her domes while the Shadow Guard tested the seams. Locust Walker gathered the ribbons and the minds that could wield them. Illyria brought Void Elves, who knew what it meant to live with a knife pressed to the inside of the skull and to decide each morning to keep breathing. The Shadow Guard seized the Dark Heart from Goblin hands and they moved to a new engine. They had built a copy of what they had once studied, not in Neverstorm, but on the broken plains of the world they had lost. They named it Manaforge Omega. If earlier Manaforges had ground energy into coin for an empire, this one was a battery for a god. In its heart, the Dark Heart sat on panels cut just for it, while machines fed arcane streams into the relic. Every pulse through that lattice woke the memory of an old hunger. And the campaign that followed was not a single straight advance. It unfolded through strikes and countermoves threaded across domes and wastes. There were meetings where old enemies stood in the same tent and pretended the word ally did not stick in the mouth. There were moments in which the Ravel's past came to light, and the charge they had made on the day Koresh fell. Faced with a Void Lord that could not be stopped by ordinary means, they had weaponized the same ribbons that held their souls together and directed that force at their own world. They had shattered Koresh to deny Dimensius a hold on the world soul. The choice saved a people, but it broke a planet. And the living did not agree about whether that choice could be forgiven or whether it needed forgiveness to stand. But all the while, Salhadar's return tightened the noose. He bent the Wastelanders with old law and claimed their hands by invoking impossible oaths. He offered power to those who would take it. He marked dissent for purging. He spoke of survival and meant coronation. The Shadow Guard ringed Manaforge Omega with ranks. The hum inside the forge rose, and the dark heart grew darker. But when the gates opened, the coalition that charged through them carried 1,000 years of grief. Koresh Trust banners cut across shadowed walls, void elves moved like the echo of an older war, ethereal blades flashed as if memory itself could kill. And Locust Walker stepped where the pool tilted and kept the ground steady with the ease of a master who had paid for every single lesson. Illyria walked into the heart of a problem she had studied since the day she first touched the void and refused to lose herself to it. Nexus King Salhadar stood before the great machine he had helped design in silence years before his death. He embodied king, priest, judge, and engineer as one being. He had crossed the distance that most would call impossible and returned without shame. His people had bled for him, and he had traded them. He raised his hand to call the last oath he thought he possessed, and the answer came from a woman who had learned to live with shadow rather than serve it. Illyria did not parley. The hall echoed with a strike that ended a crown. The machine did not pause. The dark heart had its own momentum and its own logic. Dimensius loomed inside that lattice and reached for a bridge into the world. Xal'atath arrived with a smile that made every ally check their footing. She had known Dimensius as master. She had broken that bond. She had an older plan, and it was not anyone else's. For a heartbeat, forces that had never trusted one another fought in the same direction, and that was enough. They severed the lines in sequence until a hum rose to a scream, and then buckled. The forge stuttered, but the room filled with a cold that ate colour. Dimensius did not accept defeat as natural law. He pulled them inward. Threads of light and shadow wound around Illyria and Locust Walker and their unlikely companions. The fight moved into the dark heart. Inside that prison, the rules matched its maker. Hunger wrote physics. Memory kept them from falling through the floor, and Locust Walker gave weight to places that wanted to be holes. Illyria took the edge of the void into her hands again and did not flinch. Xal'atath changed the angle of that knife, and they cut. The shape that had once stepped into the sky over Koresh came apart. They returned to a quiet that did not feel safe. A problem solved by force often reveals a deeper problem waiting. The dark heart held the pieces of a void lord and the intent of a woman who never hid her ambition. But afterwards, Locust Walker did not leave that hall. The story of how his students would carry his lessons belongs to another night. For now, the engine fell silent. The banners of the Koresh Trust still moved in the stale air. Survivors stepped into the light for the first time in years and blinked hard. What stands after a battle says as much as what fell. The Shadow Guard, deprived of their king, learned that oaths to the dead pull in different directions. The Wastelanders saw a world soul tremble and chose sacrifice over fury. Venari and her allies kept planting life in domes and deserts, and the Protectorate remembered why it broke from the Ethereum. The Ethereum story now has a cut that will never heal. Illyria turned her face towards another hunt, and Xal'atath left with a prize and a plan only she can define. As for Koresh, fragments hold. Domes glow at dusk. Traders in Tazavesh count what they can and share what they cannot keep. The Ravel's legacy has a new page. The Reshi ribbons continue to bind minds and cities. An old saying among the Ethereals emerged after Dimensius came, speaking of threads and how the living choose which ones to keep when the fabric tears. Koresh keeps choosing. It has a chance now, and choice matters as much as victory.